Dr. William Butler is an outreach officer and associate lecturer at the University of Kent. He is the author of the Irish Amateur Military Tradition, 1854 to 1992, which is published by Manchester University Press. And he is currently in the process of producing a new, much anticipated work on Irish recruitment during the Great War with Dr. Tim Bowman and is it Dr. Michael Wheatley at the University of Kent, to be published by Liverpool University Press. And William is going to talk to us about the British Army mutinies after the First World War. William.
Thank you very much, Tom. Lovely, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here this afternoon. It's actually quite unusual in a way for me to not be talking about Ireland for most of this talk. That's normally when I've been here in the past to do talks here at PRONI. It's normally talking about the Irish amateur military tradition or Irish recruitment in some way. And today I'm sort of moving on a little bit to one of my sort of pet projects that I've developed over the last few years, which has been labelled and characterised as the British Army mutinies in 1919. I'm going to call them the Demobilization Strikes in 1919 throughout the course of the paper, but I think they were mutinies. I'm sort of going with really what the authorities characterised them as, at least anyway. And it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour really of 1919 in that period immediately after the First World War. And what really drew me to this subject was, well, you know, the war ends in November 1918, and what happens with that massive citizen army in those the years after. And really, that's what sort of led me to looking at these strikes. So I'll start with Hague, why not? So in a memorandum to the War Cabinet in October 1917, so over a year before the signing of the armistice, Hague wrote the following: "Immediately hostilities cease, we must be prepared for a general relaxation of the bonds of discipline. Men's minds, energies and thoughts will no longer be occupied by the task of defeating and destroying the enemy, but will trend naturally towards early return home. Hence, as soon as demobilization commences, a feeling of jealousy will arise. Men will keenly watch the departures of others and will institute comparisons as to their respective claims. There will be generally an unsettled state, and as the natural consequences of a prolonged and arduous war, nerves will be in an irritable and an unstable condition. We have therefore to realise that the temper of the troops during this period will be a factor not to be lightly disregarded." So Hague wrote this in response to the draft plans for military demobilisation, which had been, they'd been drawing those plans up actually since 1916. And these plans specified that men would leave the army based on their occupation, assessed on the economic needs of the country, and not judged by the length of their service. While stating that he understood that these requirements, he understood these requirements, he believed that the disciplinary side of demobilisation had not been given sufficient attention. In a rebuttal letter, he was told that the economy must take precedence, and that, quote, "powerful aid to the maintenance of discipline in France will be afforded by the knowledge that any active in discipline will, in accordance with the regulations which have been drafted to carry out the scheme of demobilisation, entail delay in the man's return to this country." After the turbulent few months of strikes and collective disobedience, sorry, well, that's not working, there we go, in the armed forces following the cessation of hostilities in November 1918, this memorandum resurfaced and was presented once more to the Cabinet in February 1919 by Winston Churchill, the newly appointed Secretary of State for War. As a supplement to it, Churchill stated that, quote, "it will be seen that he, Hague, forecasted accurately the state of indiscipline and disorganisation which would arise in the army if favouritism were to rule in regard to the discharge of men. Additionally, that it was, quote, surprising that the Commander-in-Chief's prescient warnings were utterly ignored and the army left to be irritated and almost convulsed by a complicated artificial system open at every point to suspicion of jobbery and humbug. There was certainly no doubting Haig's knowledge of the army under his command and the risk that demobilisation had on the prospect of a breakdown in discipline. And it's this indiscipline that I'm going to talk to you about today. To show this, and again mainly due to limitations of time, I'm going to give you a few examples of some of these strikes and how the authorities dealt with these soldiers striking. What I'd like to argue, and hopefully this becomes clear, is that very few soldiers had any political motivation. The idea that the British soldier is no Bolshevik. Their service and therefore their discipline during the war was conditional and couldn't last beyond the end of hostilities. Primarily, they were citizen soldiers, both volunteers and conscripts alike, and they'd been inculcated with the belief that their discipline came from their patriotism and especially their self-sacrifice. They felt that by November 1918 they had carried out, they sort of demonstrated enough patriotism and carried enough self-sacrifice to justify their immediate demobilisation, and therefore discipline was no longer relevant to them. So throughout 1917 and 1918, though reaching to the point of mutiny at Etaples, unrest was relatively minor. This doesn't mean that fears didn't exist, especially within the context of the Russian Revolution. Concerns about the fragile nature of indiscipline and the potential Bolshevist influence on soldiers had surfaced when soldiers and workers' councils had been formed in 1917. In July in that year, Lord Derby had stated to the War Cabinet, quote, "In view of the fact that the army of today is by no means as highly disciplined as that in existence before the war, and also that the classes of men serving at the present moment include individuals of every shade of education and opinion, it is probable that the movement to encourage soldiers to take part in political questions will be fanned by certain political factions for their own ends." Historian Chris Wrigley has suggested that it's really no surprise that leading members of the government expressed concern about the spread of Bolshevism in Britain, and that the potential for unrest in the armed forces only accentuated these fears. Though unfounded, these fears certainly informed decision-making and were exacerbated by the sort of focused effort by elements of the labour movement in particular to enlist support from the armed forces once strikes had broken out. For an establishment already suspicious of trade unionism, this must have been an alarming development. And as we shall see, the printed press, especially the Daily Mail and the Daily Herald, did little to help in these matters. Overall, soldiers and institutions such as the press towed the line, as they had done for much of the war. But the system of demobilisation and the consequences of its perceived unjust nature placed the continued good discipline of the British Army in doubt for much of 1919. So to think about early trouble, really. As I said, plans for demobilisation had actually been underway since 1916, so it's not as if the authorities were caught unprepared, really, when the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918. Many soldiers were caught by surprise, though, and in contrast to the scenes at home, reactions were relatively muted on the front line. So Charles Carrington recalled that, quote, "Victory was sudden and complete, and the general sensation was that of awakening from a nightmare." Percy Crozier stated that though men and women all over the world, quote, "went mad, the fighting men fresh from the line thanked God for delivery." George Jameson even went as far as to say that once the initial shock had subsided, he had the feeling of having been sacked and kicked out of a job. It essentially made him feel like he had been made redundant. Others recalled awe, great relief, bewilderment and shock at the speed of the German collapse. Rapid demobilisation soon became a rallying cry during the election, the general election in December 1918. Newspapers made the business of demobilisation theirs, and the Daily Mail, which had labelled itself for much of the war as the soldiers' newspaper, ran a daily column, which I showed a moment ago in the previous slide, entitled Dilly Dally, which gave exhaustive examples of demobilisation delays. The authorities had devised a priority system which, driven by the needs of the peacetime economy, would be how the army would be demobilised. The first soldiers were to be released would be so-called demobilisers, those who perform tasks in civilian life which would speed up the demobilisation of others. These would be followed by so-called pivotal men who could provide employment for others. Thirdly, there were so-called slip men, labelled as such because of the slips of paper that authorised their demobilisation, and they essentially were individuals who could prove that they had a job waiting for them once they were demobilised and returned to civilian life. After these groups, a general demobilisation could occur. And it was the third category, the slip men, which was to provide the catalyst for some of the early unrest in early 1919, because the slip men were quite often, they're not exclusively, but quite often, those who had entered the army later on in the war. So the first major trouble occurred at Folkestone on the 3rd of January. According to some reports, upwards of 10,000 men refused to attend parade, having held a meeting the previous day, and also, importantly, declined to embark on boats bound for France. Instead, the large body of men marched to Folkestone Town Hall, which is that building in the background there, and paid a visit to the mayor of Folkestone. Speeches then were made of what was the press reported as a moderate tone, claiming that many applications for demobilisation were being ignored, despite men having jobs waiting for them. By the evening of the 3rd, the situation had been resolved when military officials, which with the approval of the War Office, had decided that rather than proceed with disciplinary measures against the men, they would be given time to explain and to prepare their own individual situations. As I say, the men were dealt with individually. Those with contracts for work were immediately demobilised. Those with contracts which were not quite fully in order were permitted an additional week's leave. And those who had no prospects of contract were sent back to their units, sent back to France. Lord Milner, who was at that time still the Secretary of State for War, wrote to David Lloyd George stating that these concessions were the best way out of a bad business. It seemed then as if the disturbances were over as quickly as they had began. But this leniency very, very quickly came back to haunt the authorities. So within 24 hours, in fact, other strikes swept across the country, beginning in Dover, so just down the road. Army Service Corps men stationed at Osterley Park drove to Whitehall to put their case directly to the Prime Minister. One participant told a reporter that, quote, "We have been informed that our branch of the service would be the last to be demobilised. Most of us have had over 2 years in France and have been wounded." In the week following the demonstration at Folkestone, using the historian Andrew Rothstein's thorough accounts of the strikes across Great Britain, a very conservative estimate puts the number of soldiers striking as a result of demobilisation delays at just over 52,000, which is about 1.5% of men under arms. While only a fraction of the total, it's unsurprising that the authorities were concerned. When men of the Army Service Corps descended on Whitehall from camps on the outskirts of London, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, wrote to Lord Derby stating that, quote, "The heart of the present troubles in the army lies in the reckless speeches and promises made during the recent elections, and in constant civilian and therefore ignorant and dangerous interference in our demobilisation scheme. Exactly where we are drifting, for we are drifting, I don't know. At the present moment, there are rows of lorries outside this office and 1,000 lorrymen up from Kempton with demands of sorts. One thing is certain, that unless the Prime Minister buckles and makes it clear that he and the government are solid behind the War Office and the officers of the army, we shall lose the army, and then the navy, and then the air force." The ignorant civilians that to which Wilson was referring were undoubtedly, I think, elements of the press. So when reporting the first strikes, the Daily Mail, under the headline "Brainless Demobilisation," stated that Sir Eric Geddes had, quote, "so far successfully evaded the rope and lamppost that are said to await the politician who fails in his task, and that the red tabs were responsible for the blundering at Folkestone and elsewhere. Furthermore, that, quote, "the lack of brains and of foresight displayed by the War Office is interfering with the restoration of national trade and prosperity, and that owing to the abundant respect which officials have for one another and their capacity for taking as long as possible to do nothing, we doubt whether even Folkestone will prove to be a sufficient awakening to them." And really from these first strikes, what you get from the authorities is attempts to damage control. So immediately after the first wave of strikes, military censors put a stop to all, or pretty much all, reporting of these disturbances across the country. They just disappear from newspapers in particular. And this clearly influenced the stance of the Daily Mail. So the day after their vitriolic article about demobilisation, a more moderate article commented under the headline "Steady" that, quote, "aroused at last by the protests of newspapers and the public, the authorities are taking action to remedy the delays and individual injustices of demobilisation. They have met with good-humoured demonstrations of the soldiers tactfully and in the right spirit. The men will gain nothing further by organised unrest. Their common sense will tell them that any indiscipline will only prejudice the efforts to improve and speed up the machinery." While not condemning the men for striking, the tone was clearly one of conciliation, urging men to respect authority. For the Sir George Lansbury-owned Herald, a left-wing newspaper, however, the tone remained rather belligerent. The strikes were in fact what its front page described as the Great Mutiny. It was sheer, this is a quote, "It was sheer, flat, brazen, open and successful mutiny. They, the soldiers, knew it and they did it." For the newspaper's special correspondent, who was apparently in Folkestone, this was born because of incomprehensible forms and red tape. Trade unionists had been elected as officials for a new soldiers' union, a point stressed by the paper. Now was not the time for conciliation, in their view, it was time for action. During the following week, the paper noted how, quote, "a great silence had descended upon the capitalist press." Rather insightfully in some ways, articles stated that the troubles had come from the government, and that the government, what they labelled as the government press, had only themselves to thank. A month previously, they had been, quote, "vociferously denouncing Dilly and Daley. The Prime Minister was promising that things should be speeded up, and that now they were solemnly lecturing the troops on the virtues of keeping steady." Despite claims made by the Herald, feelings of jealousy and frustration do appear to have existed. In his memoir, John Jackson stated that the thought of so many old companions, quote, "gradually dwindling away from the regiment, made the remainder of us feel restless." George Ashurst claimed that the vast majority of soldiers got the army out of their minds and simply wished to leave. The thought of staying was not favourable. Roland Fielding wrote to his wife in early February that, quote, "the raging desire still continues to be demobilised quickly. Nevertheless, I feel pretty sure that for many there will be pathetic disillusionment." Even as early as December 1918, William Andrews wrote that it was a great grievance with us that munition workers were at once freed to get what jobs were now going, whilst we were kept in the army. Furthermore, that, quote, "one feels a little suspicious of the army authorities. They seem in no hurry to give up their power over the millions of soldiers who have not the slightest intention of serving again once they get out of khaki." He concluded that thousands of officers have had the time of their lives and are sorry it is nearing an end. Ministers also began to express their dismay at the attitude of the press, in terms not dissimilar to those in the Herald. So Winston Churchill, having taken over as Secretary of State for War on the 10th of January 1919, presented a memorandum to the War Cabinet 4 days later. In it, he indicated that the press had been allowed to run wild on the subject of demobilisation and that statements had been made with no foundation in fact. He believed that, quote, influential or an influential part of the press, notably the Daily Mail, Daily Express and other cheap newspapers which circulate widely in the army, had published articles abusing the military authorities and had specifically undermined discipline as a result. Clearly, now that the armistice had been signed, the press was no longer playing to the fiddle of Lloyd George and his government, as they had for most of the war. The press barons, Lords Beaverbrook and Northcliffe, who had directed propaganda for much of the war, would have to come back into line and support the government until a new plan could be devised. Within days of his cabinet memorandum, Churchill presented a new scheme, one which he had devised with the help of Wilson and Haig. On the 17th of January, the decision was made. All men who had listed in 1914 and 1915 would be demobilised as soon as transport was available to bring them home, a total of 2.2 million men. Furthermore, all men who had joined the army after the 1st of January 1916 would be retained as part of the Army of Occupation. In explaining the new scheme to Lloyd George, who was in Paris, Churchill stated that, quote, "Under the existing scheme, the discipline of the whole army is being rotted. I am very anxious about the state of the army, both in France and at home." He believed that statements made by Lloyd George had done much to calm the situation, and that newspapers, quote, "had seen the red light and have been trying to help as much as possible instead of exciting discontent." Both Lloyd George and Andrew Bonar Law initially rejected the new scheme, especially because so many men would have to be retained and that conscription would have to remain in place, a thorny issue and one which would need a little bit of work in order to convince the public of its necessity. Churchill, Wilson and Haig then travelled to Paris on the 23rd of January and finally managed to convince Lloyd George. The next hurdle was to convince the public that this was the correct course of action to take. So the best way to achieve this aim was to obtain the support of the press. On the same day that the scheme was presented to the War Cabinet, under a pledge of secrecy, Churchill sent full details of it to Lord Northcliffe. In explaining it, he stated that he did not fear the course of such a policy, quote, "provided that a strong lead is given and that the reasons which make each step necessary are fully and frankly explained." Upon receiving these details, Northcliffe instructed his editors to publicise and to support the scheme, stating that, quote, "all my newspapers will do exactly what you wish on the subject." Churchill also met with other correspondents, newspaper correspondents, in the last days of January. After that meeting, he wrote to Lloyd George on the 29th of January, "The newspaper men took it all like lambs." The new scheme was indeed launched on the 30th of January, and true to the word of Northcliffe, the Daily Mail wholeheartedly supported it, stating, quote, "nothing has been more honourable to our soldiers than the way in which they have received the new scheme, and the evidence of patience and patriotism which they are giving after their magnificent conduct on the battlefield. Moreover, that the new priority scheme, based on length of service, satisfied the soldiers' instinctive respect for fairness. If soldiers were happy with the new scheme, then how could the public complain?" But notwithstanding the new scheme, on Monday the 27th of January, so a few days before, a major incident occurred at Calais involving the Army Service Corps and the Army Ordnance Corps. These men organised a strike complaining about their long working hours and the poor conditions in the camps. This had merged with the frustration over the slow pace of demobilisation. A seditious speech was made by a private. He was arrested, and from then on things spiralled out of control. The men went out on parade, and when the sergeant major gave the order to move, not a single soldier did, as there were rumours that the arrested private had been shot. These rumours were unfounded, and the soldier in question was eventually requisitioned by the striking men, who, despite numerous discussions with high-ranking officers, didn't waver in their position. The location of the disturbance in this case was significant because thousands of men passed through the camps in and nearby Calais en route to and from the front after periods of leave in Britain. And these men were then brought face to face with the demands of these strikers. Many soon joined them, and also some even attempted to commandeer boats back to England. The men elected a committee headed mainly by trade unionists and continued their collective disobedience. Haig, now anxious that things didn't get further out of control, directed General Byng, who was the commander at Calais, to quell the disturbances at all cost if they spread to the town itself. Quote, "discipline must be maintained, and rioters, if they cannot be arrested, must be shot. Those men who have returned from leave have no ground for complaint and appear to have been led astray by Bolshevik agitators." Eventually, on the morning of the 30th of January, men from 105th Brigade 35th Division entered the camp and surrounded the tents and huts. The men were told that those who wished to break off the strike could do so with no repercussions. The four-man committee then addressed the men and urged them to continue their strike, but they were ignored, essentially. These men were then arrested as they tried to discourage defectors from the strike. So this strike was over and relatively quickly without having to resort to violence. Machine gun companies had actually been brought up to surround the camp and were even located in the camp offices ready to fire upon the strikers. What the strike demonstrates is how quickly discipline could break down, though, when men were removed from their own units. The military authorities were shaken by these events, especially because they occurred at the same time as other major strikes across the UK. But Churchill remained of the opinion that the unrest had occurred as a hangover from the previous demobilisation scheme. Smaller demonstrations continued to take place, though, especially in service units and those involved in the lines of communication. Much of the blame for these incidents were attributed to the Herald League. Its political organ was the Daily Herald, the newspaper, and also the Soldiers' Union most associated with the Daily Herald, the Sailors, Soldiers and Airmen's Union. The Daily Herald remained most aloof of the establishment and continued to print articles critical of the authorities in their demobilisation plans. The government were quick to act upon this perceived threat, especially when it got wind of the fact that the Herald League wished to attempt to get soldiers who had joined the forces as part of the Derby scheme to demobilise themselves in May 1919, 6 months after the end of hostilities. By July, many soldiers also feared the possibility of being sent to Russia as part of the British Army's expedition there, and unrest once more increased. Throughout the middle of 1919, there are many examples of a backlash towards the trade union movement in this respect, and particularly their attempts to enlist support of serving soldiers. Intelligence reports from across the country consistently pointed to the fact that despite their best attempts, ex-servicemen unions had no success in attracting honorary members. So as a serving soldier, you couldn't be part of a member, but you could join a union as an honorary member. A man in the Royal Army Service Corps had visited a camp to enlist support in the Sailors, Soldiers and Airmen's Union in late May, but was forced to retire as a result of the reception he had met, the sort of negative reception he had met. Even those who had already been discharged and were active members of soldiers' unions appear to have been resolute in their attitude towards the labour movement. Though a less extreme organisation, members of the National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Sailors and Soldiers, which had even put up candidates in the 1918 general election, rejected calls at its conference to ally itself to a socialist political body. The intelligence summary indicated that, quote, "It is satisfactory that the results of the conference point to the fact that the ex-servicemen desire to stand alone and by a majority in every case have testified their determination to refuse to become the tools of unprincipled and professional agitators." It went on to conclude that, quote, "The attitude of the soldier is improving every day. Despite the attempt by agitators to cajole and flatter him to become disloyal to his sovereign and the tool of revolutionaries as represented by the Herald League, the soldier is realising that these people are not his friends but rather his enemies." Throughout the summer, though, incidents continued to take place which risked the improving state of discipline. Once again, soldiers refused to embark for overseas at Dover, and over 1,800 men mutinied at the Eastern Command Labour Centre at Sutton. The latter were also concerned that they were to be sent overseas. In both of these cases, it would seem that there was still concern that they would be sent to Russia. In August, 17 men of the 3rd West Yorkshire Regiment were sentenced by court-martial to 9 months imprisonment with hard labour. In July, they had refused to obey an order to parade in fighting equipment. They claimed that they had taken to heart an expression used by the company sergeant major in passing that order, and that now peace was declared, they considered themselves as civilians. When questioned about the incident, the Sergeant Major denied using certain expressions, stating that he had not, in fact, called them bastards. He had actually called them a lot of Bolshevists. So this latest spate prompted one newspaper editorial to declare the following, and I will be finishing in a moment, don't worry. So, quote, "The recurrence of incidents that indicate the presence in the army of a good deal of unrest is much to be regretted. I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the bulk, as well as to misrepresent the character of the grievances which led some soldiers to demonstrate in a manner not consistent with discipline. The British soldier is no Bolshevik, and now that he has every reason to believe that there is no intention to treat him other than fairly in the matters as to which he has felt uneasy." So just to very, very briefly conclude, reporting in August 1919, Churchill concluded, "How foolish to suppose that the armies which took more than 4 years to spread about all over the world could be brought home again by a wave of the wand." By this time it was becoming clear that Bolshevism was no threat in the armed forces. Though discipline broke down, it had more to do with the perceived unjust nature of the demobilisation scheme and the fact that for some the notions of these notions of self-sacrifice and of patriotism no longer held relevance as a means to maintain order, despite some attempts by soldiers' unions and other organisations to mobilise support for their cause. On the 17th of October 1919, Churchill finally declared that demobilisation was complete. He reported that in the 11 months since the armistice, an average of 10,000 men had been discharged every day. It was true to say, he said, that the army had melted away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William. And on that theme, we now move to a case study with Dr. Mario Draper, who is a lecturer in modern British and European history at the University of Kent, and he is author of The Belgian Army and Society from Independence to the Great War, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. His interests include British, Irish and European military history in the 19th and 20th centuries, but in particular the relationship between societies and military forces, and especially regional identity. Mario.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My paper today, thankfully for you, is not to do with Belgium. I'm sure we're all delighted. But instead, another pet project, which came out of my undergraduate dissertation. In fact, looking back on it, barely a footnote in the dissertation, but then something that stuck with me and I've pursued since then. Now, I presume most people have heard of the Connaught Rangers Mutiny, but I'm not entirely sure. So, show of hands, who has heard of Connaught Rangers Mutiny? Yeah, okay, so it's fairly well established, fairly well known. Now, it's a really interesting case study, not just in terms of the demobilisation of the British Army, the legacy of the First World War, in the immediate sort of melting away of the British Army, to use Will's term, but also in the remobilisation of the army, because obviously, the British Army returns to real soldiering. It's got an empire to police, and therefore the army has to think about what it's going to look like in the future. And this kind of ties all of that stuff together. So, on the 5th of July 1920, The Times published an article entitled "Tampering with the Army, Sinn Féin in India." And it related a course of events which occurred between the 28th of June and the 1st of July 1920 in the 1st Battalion of the Connaught Rangers, stationed in the Punjab in India. Specifically, the 300 or so men who grounded arms in basically being in sympathy with Ireland. So as the headline suggests, as the reasoning that the soldiers gave for grounding arms suggests, this was a heavily politicised move by these 300 or so men, 61 of which were later segregated from the mass and tried by courts-martial as ringleaders in inciting this mutiny. Of these, 14 received death sentences, 13 were then commuted and only one, that of James Joseph Daley of Tyrrell's Pass, County Westmeath, was executed on the 2nd of November 1920 for his part in leading a group of about 70 or 80 men in an attack on the magazine in the outpost at Solon, so the mutiny occurs in 2 separate places, to try and retrieve weapons in order to further their cause. This attack on the magazine had caused 2 deaths and left another soldier severely injured. Daley was shot on the 2nd of November 1920 and later went down as a nationalist martyr for his role. It all kind of gets tied up in this narrative of nationalist martyrdom as the mutiny kind of mutates from what it actually was into something completely different. And depending on how much time I give myself, I will go into that in greater detail. So, here is the man himself, James Daley, a young man, aged 20, who dared to strike at the heart of the British Empire, the British establishment, by leading this mutiny. A man who apparently had a conflicted identity of being an Irishman in a British uniform, but a man whose loyalty to Irish nationalism was in absolutely no doubt whatsoever. Also, the story continues to be told by some. So let's just have a quick look at this newspaper article. The Independent, which was published on the 9th of January 1999, Fergal Keane wrote a sort of lengthy piece detailing the events of the mutiny in India. I've just picked out a small quote, and he says, "That is how armies work. Soldiers are trained to react instinctively to the shouted command. When mutinies happen, they are for the most part the result of soldiers' anger, poor leadership, bad conditions, and heavy losses. But what happened with Private Daley was different. His choice, and that of the men who supported him, went to the core of his identity. An Irishman in a British uniform, he was still a British citizen. In legal terms, he owed his loyalty to the king. But, and this is where the emotive bit comes out, doesn't it? But his heart told him otherwise. It's a choice few soldiers ever have to make." Right, so again, it's starting to kind of build this image of the mutiny as being a very politically inspired event. And this has been taken up in the historiography. Particularly in the 60s and the 70s, T.P. Kilfeather and Sam Pollock wrote some very emotive accounts of the mutiny and wrapped it up, like I say, in this nationalist veneer, stating very clearly that the mutiny was inspired by events back in Ireland, and that undoubtedly kind of Sinn Féinism was the root cause. Now, I'm not disputing that politics played a part in the breakdown of discipline. I mean, these men who laid down their weapons at the start of the mutiny did so by openly stating that they were in sympathy with Ireland. But I don't think it is the primary cause for the breakdown in discipline. It certainly wasn't a premeditated Sinn Féin cell kind of operating in the British Army to strike a blow from within and bring the whole British Empire to its knees. That certainly wasn't the case, although it has been described as such. Instead, I think we need to look at military reasons, predominantly, not political ones, to explain what happened. Firstly, what I would term institutional failings in the British Army post-war, and related poor officer-man relations. All the evidence suggests this, in my opinion, whether you look at the military records, if you kind of drill down into the courts-martial proceedings, and particularly in the aftermath of the events, if you start to unpack the rather conflicting and rather changeable narratives of the survivors of the mutiny, the Connaught Rangers, veterans of the mutiny, who change their story as they kind of go along, trying to reap the rewards and benefits from the Irish state after the event. And it very clearly becomes evident, to me at least, that we are talking about a military breakdown, not a political mutiny. So, just to give you an idea of where we are, so we are in India. The battalion was stationed primarily at Wellington Barracks, at Jullundur, with a couple of detachments that were then sent off into the Simla Hills in Solon and a little further north at Jutto as well. Now, the mutiny began on the 28th of June at Jullundur. Okay, initially when 5 men, later 4, but 5 men, Joseph Hawes, Christopher Sweeney, Patrick Gogarty, Stephen Lally and William Daley, who was James Daley's brother, presented themselves to Lance Corporal John Flannery, like I say, stating that they could no longer soldier for the British Army because they were in sympathy with Ireland. Now at this stage, Flannery tried to dissuade the men from carrying this out. The consequences of mutiny are really severe. Don't do it. Which is interesting because he then later rebrands himself as kind of like the key mutineer. It was at this point that he took command of the mutiny, and he would later kind of paint himself as the hero of the events. But initially he tries to dissuade them, convinces William Daley, ironically, to not participate. But the other 4 present themselves to the guardroom and they get knocked up. And very quickly things escalate, and depending on which account you kind of read, 200 or so, perhaps a few more men join in with the mutiny in sympathy. I mean, it's peaceful, it's not violent, but they definitely have things on their mind that they want to express to their officers. Obviously, a mutiny has potential ramifications, particularly in India. We're not too far away from Amritsar, not too far removed from the massacre. So there's a whole kind of subplot brewing there. Very quickly, the mutineers the barracks is relieved by forces. The mutineers marched out to a camp. The ringleaders are separated from the masses, and it's all kind of done and dusted at Jullundur. Now, interestingly, they send emissaries out to the hill stations in the Simla Hills to try and get A and C companies involved in the mutiny. A company at Jutto stays completely loyal, but C company, where Daley is at Solon, get wind of what's happening at Jullundur and join in the fray from the 30th of June. Now here's where I think the first kind of clue to the military and not political nature of the mutiny is. It's painted that Daley is the martyr, the hero of this narrative, the man who very clearly had Sinn Féin sympathies and was the leader of everything. He didn't find out about it until 2 days after the mutiny had begun at Jullundur, right? He only sprang into action on the 30th of June. So automatically in my head I'm starting to question really how much this is being politically inspired. Anyway, things at Solon go a little bit wrong. Like I say, they agree to kind of have a peaceful mutiny as such. The weapons are taken away from them, stored in the magazine at Solon, which is then guarded by elements of the company that remain loyal. Daley and his men decide actually that's probably not a great idea. Maybe they're going to be shot by the loyal elements. Because there are rumours going around that those at Jullundur have been massacred, so maybe they're going to meet the same fate. So they try and storm the magazine. Like I say, it ends up in 2 men being killed, another seriously wounded. At this stage, Daley allegedly stands up in the middle of the attack and declares, "I am James Joseph Daley of Tyrrell's Pass, County Westmeath, and I'm the leader of the mutiny." Very clearly identifies himself as the leader. But he's only the leader of the Solon bit. Now, there are many kind of reasons that have been put forth subsequently, not just the political reasons for why the mutiny actually occurred. So Anthony Babington, who was the first of a few Irish historians who went into further detail into the archives to work out exactly what had gone on here, to try and dispel, or at least to qualify the political narrative that was being spoken of. And his assessment, which kind of marries with the regimental history, is that these were green recruits who were not accustomed to the trials of military life, particularly in the searing heat of the Indian summer, and therefore this is why, discipline broke down. And he proves this by saying that out of 206 men who joined the regiment in the last couple of drafts, 172 of those were identified as taking part in the mutiny. But just because they were new to the battalion in India doesn't mean that they were green recruits lacking any experience. So if you look at the 61 ringleaders of the mutiny and break it down, break their military experience down, actually you have a very experienced core of the mutiny there. So 30 had spent 5 years or more in the army. 6 had spent more than 4 years, 8 had spent more than 3 years, 3 had spent more than 2 years, 4 had spent over a year, and 10 for an unspecified period of time. Couldn't quite work it out. But the majority had wartime experience. Right? We're talking about June 1920. These are not, completely green recruits. In fact, J.W.C. Francis, 19th Hussars, and the last surviving witness of the courts-martial proceedings, actually agreed that, that inexperience probably wasn't the key factor. His view was that beyond the mitigating circumstances that could have affected any unit, such as the hot weather, that the reasons for the mutiny were, and in no particular order, unrest in Ireland, letters from home, very poor discipline, and indeed of the entirely unintelligent sort, and extremely bad relations between officers and their men. Now this is where I come in. I really think that it's very much the last couple of those points. Officer-man relations in the Connaught Rangers by 1920 had suffered from a unique series of events that had occurred in the First World War. Right? There's a legacy of the First World War that I feel plays a significant role in the breakdown of discipline. Because there was a rather bizarre division of experience between the regular battalions and the service battalions during the war. So the regular battalions, apart from a very brief period fighting in 1914 on the Western Front, actually spent the majority of the war in the less intense theatre in Mesopotamia. Whereas by contrast, the 5th and the 6th battalions fought predominantly at Gallipoli and key engagements on the Western Front of the Somme and what not. Which meant that the regular pre-war officer cadre spent the majority of the war not in the most intense of theatres, but actually were stationed out in Mesopotamia. And these are the officers that then return to the regiment, or stay with the regiment after the war, and the officers that we see in India in 1920. By contrast, the rank and file are made up of men from across the battalions during the First World War, the Connaught Rangers, and from other units as well, who potentially had a very different expectation of officer-man relations as a result of their combat experience, and particularly in the service battalion. So if you read your David Englander's and the like, his opinion is that the concept of officer-man relations changed significantly over the course of the war, as the army mutated from a strictly professional regular force into a mass citizen army. That although an officer's authority was in theory non-negotiable, actually, right, men were very keen judges of officer performance and expected a certain degree of paternalism, of being looked after, of being cared for, not just out of the front line, but in the front line. If officers were too reckless, it's not unheard of that they might have got a bullet in the back themselves. Right? But there is a shifting dynamic there that meant that the balance of power wasn't entirely top-down. It wasn't carrot and stick necessarily, but it was much more malleable than that. So you've got a situation in 1920 where you've got officers who are pre-war regular officers who didn't serve in the most intense theatres, commanding a lot of men with war experience who may have served under very different types of officers, which means that relationship already there is friction. Besides that, there's also an imbalance. Right, there's a top-heavy composition in the Connaught Rangers by 1920, and this is again a legacy of the First World War. So after demobilisation, there is an absolute, what's the phrase that someone used, I can't remember, Keith Jeffrey, I think used, an embarrassing surplus of officers in the British Army. Those temporary commissions obviously go, but there's still a huge number of officers remaining who want to continue on their service in the British Army, many of which have received huge steps in promotion as a result of the war. And the Connaught Rangers end up in a situation whereby they have a very large number, comparatively, of majors in the regiment and comparatively few captains compared to normal regiments. And if you listen to the interview with FWS Francis, who was the adjutant at the end of the war, which is on the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, his view very much is that this top-heavy imbalance caused some of the major issues with the breakdown of discipline, because majors, as he says, quite a senior rank, and they didn't like necessarily to spend too much time or get to know their men too closely. That this was the job of the more junior officers, of the lieutenants, even of the captains. And so the fact that you had a disproportionate number of majors and comparatively few captains in the battalion again created a dislocation between officers and their men. So, I just put it into context, whereas a normal regiment might have 3 or 4 majors, by the time going on, I looked at 25 different battalions on foreign service in June 1920, and they average out at somewhere between 3 and 4 majors that they'd have. Connaught Rangers, right, had 5 and had 5 at the time, but 6 on the books. Not entirely sure if all 6 are there. By contrast, the number of captains in an average battalion was 6. Connaught Rangers only had 3. So there's your statistical evidence for it. But this is then backed up by what others said of the regiment, their experience of coming into contact with the Connaught Rangers. So here is Brigadier C.I. Gerard, 51st Sikh Regiment, who noted the very poor impression given off by the Connaught Rangers officers. And he wrote, "We played a lot of football against the Rangers, but their officers were never present and their teams were run by NCOs. We gained the impression that the officers were not in close touch with their men." More worrying was Gerard's impression that senior and junior officers themselves didn't see eye to eye. That the subalterns appeared to have, quote, a chip on their shoulder and much to say against their colonel and their adjutant, which was not good to an outsider like himself to see. So it revealed potentially these structural issues in the post-war British Army that then played out in a real-life scenario to cause some kind of breakdown in discipline. It is not a unified regiment that is drawing from the regimental system, the esprit de corps that is meant to keep the whole show on the road. And it's potentially dangerous because if this could happen in the Connaught Rangers, if there are structural problems in the British Army, foreseeably could happen in other units as well, which is part of the reason why the British authorities are quite happy to claim that it was a Sinn Féin cell in the British Army, an isolated incident. They've dealt with it politically, so they're quite happy to go along with this political narrative at the start. It's much more troublesome to suggest that they haven't really worked out how to deal with this restructure of the British Army. Now, apart from the structural issues, there's also a suggestion that the Connaught Rangers just simply suffered from poor officers altogether, whose inexperience, whose lack of intelligence in some respect, particularly if you look at how they deal with the mutiny, comes to the fore under the strains and the stresses of service in India and also the mutiny itself. So the adjutant at the time, the one who succeeded Jourdain, LWL leader, was said to be sly and untrustworthy. He was neither loved nor trusted by anyone. And it said that when the 200 men appeared outside the officers' mess at Jullundore to express their concerns about continued soldiering for the British Army, to their colonel, Colonel Deacon, one of the privates targeted leader for abuse, claiming that he would knock his block off for having given him several months' punishment for what he thought was an insignificant offence. Deacon himself was described as a great bully, who ticked off senior officers in front of the juniors and, what was worse, officers in front of the men. Captain Leslie Baden at Solon was equally disliked, particularly when he cancelled the leave that the men were due in favour of a musketry course the day before the mutiny. Coincidence? I think not. In the searing heat of India, possibly the last thing you want to do is further drill or whatever it is. But again, there's a gap, I think, in understanding between what the men are feeling, what they're thinking, what they want, and what the officers feel that they should be doing. It's very difficult, isn't it, in the sort of isolated hill station in India to know how best to keep the men occupied. If you have men who are unoccupied, they can start thinking about things, and that is potentially dangerous as well. So there's a sense, almost, that the officers are overworking the men for want of anything better to do. And in total, for me, this just feels like a very toxic atmosphere, stemming from primarily military reasons, not from politics. None of this is politically motivated. To give a further example of potentially how bad the officers were, how ill-suited they were to their roles, we need look as far as Major Payne, who, quote, was rarely seen sober past the hour of 6 o'clock. Or Majors Nolan Farrell, Lloyd and Truell, who were described respectively as having no imagination, not a particularly distinguished officer, and one of those majors who never really seems to get beyond that. Right, these are hardly ringing endorsements of the men in command. And in fact, you look at how the mutinies unfold. Deacon is relieved of his command very quickly for his mishandling of the situation. Alexander at Solon, right, is also reprimanded very severely for having dithered and not listened to his subordinates, even though his subordinates, the junior officers, kind of get the rap officially because that's what they're there for. But the handling of the situation is not great by anyone, particularly that top-heavy balance of majors. So, in conclusion as to why the mutinies happened, for me it's a combination of outright incompetence on the part of many of the officers involved, an unwavering adherence to outdated methods of command and of discipline which no longer fit the post-war British Army, which had been shaped by 4 years of war. And that, again, it's those structural issues that meant that these officers, who for the most part had spent the war in Mesopotamia with the 1st Battalion and not really come to terms with this shifting dynamic of officer-man relations, weren't well equipped for. Having said that, very clearly there is a political dimension to it, in as much as the soldiers were aware of some of the things that were going on in Ireland. Newspapers potentially could have been censored slightly more. That letters from home, again, might have brought back some news of atrocities that were occurring, but that, again, in the searing heat of India, men might have been more predisposed to take these and run with these ideas and kind of blow them out of proportion. So it's very difficult to work out exactly what news had reached them, but later claims that Daley had been shouting "Up Balbriggan" before he left the UK for India. This was the reason why he mutinied is completely unfounded, because Balbriggan incident that they're referring to happened in September 1920, and the mutiny happened in June. So there's a whole conflation of what's happening back in Ireland and the reasons for the mutiny. So very clearly, from my perspective, it is not a premeditated kind of Sinn Féin attack on British rule in India, the British Army as a whole. The whole narrative kind of gets mixed up with what happens after the event, right? And the revolution and everything thereafter. That you start seeing imagery of and all sorts of bits of the narrative being changed to fit a nationalist narrative afterwards. The fact that there's a tricolour, the fact that they were wearing kind of rosettes singing Sinn Féin rebel songs, that all this kind of stuff only seems to really come to the fore in the 1920s, 1930s. well after the fact. If you look at the courts-martial proceedings, you don't get quite as much of a sense that this is a political mutiny whatsoever. So fundamentally, structural issues in the post-war British Army, which saw a top-heavy regiment in terms of its officers, go to India without the adequate experience or knowledge about how officer-man relations had evolved during the war, caused the breakdown, and there you have it, led to 61 mutineers being tried by courts-martial, one of them being shot. Thank you very much.
Right, our next section is going to deal with the medical consequences of war, looking at two distinct areas, shell shock and the flu pandemic, which came in 1918. And to kick us off is Dr. Stefanie Linden. She's a double doctor, being a consultant psychiatrist, or certainly was, in the NHS, based in Cardiff. I think you did your medical training here in Belfast.
Part of it, yeah.
In the 90s. Mm-hmm. So she knows Belfast well, and she produced a book recently with this image, which is about shell shock, published by Helion, and I do recommend getting it. It's really good. The podcast you did with me a very long time ago is also well worth listening to. Another plug, you want to, but it's well worth it. It's a Heliotrope, it's about £18, and it's certainly well worth doing. So Stefanie's moving to University of Maastricht to look at, to lecture in, I think, medical history, and she's also done a PhD in humanities at King's, so has 2 doctorates. So is a real doctor, as they say. Without much further ado, I'll introduce Stefanie, who will talk about shell shock and the consequences of war.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And in my work as a psychiatrist, I regularly encounter individuals whose life has been transformed by psychological trauma, and combat stress is one of the most intense triggers and reached epidemic dimensions in the First World War. Medical case records from that time enable us to enter a world which, since the last veterans of the war have passed away, is now inaccessible through living memory. I would like to tell you more about some of the so-called shell shock cases I found in the Queen Square archives in London. So, 18-year-old Stuart B. from the London Scottish Regiment had been sent to the front in October 1914. His case record provides a harrowing account of this teenager's experience during the first months of the war. So I quote from the case record, life in the trenches was very hard, there was considerable rain, they were not able to get water, the diet consisted of bully beef, jam, cheese and bread. The sand would come into the food and this increased the thirst. They had little chance to sleep, the eye strain was very severe. The patient had a great deal to do with handling wounded and dying soldiers, which made a deep impression on him. The first day he was in a trench, he had in his line of vision a pile of corpses, one of which had the face turned toward him and appeared to be sleeping. This made such an impression upon him that he cannot free himself of this vision. So he was 5 days and 6 nights in the trenches. The noises made by shells and the uncertainty of where they would strike caused great uneasiness and strain. Patient's comrades remarked that he did not answer when they spoke to him. Of this he knew nothing until told later on. He could not hold his weapon properly, nor shoot accurately. He was very shaky, suffered much from headache. He was sent away from the trenches November the 14th and arrived at Southampton November the 21st. So, soon after the beginning of the war, cases of nervous and mental shock flooded the home hospitals. Stuart was one of the first military casualties to be treated at the National Hospital for the Paralysed and Epileptic in London at Queen Square. There was no evidence that he was physically injured, and yet he was severely disabled. He was initially diagnosed with exhaustion psychosis, but made a rapid and complete recovery. So at the beginning of the First World War, the National Hospital had already gained an international reputation for the treatment of neurological disorders and had also pioneered neurosurgery in England. Contemporaries referred to Queen Square as the Temple of British Neurology, and this is a photograph taken just before the First World War. The hospital actually still looks like that today. I mean, this is this part actually, if you go there, you can still see the hospital like that. So soldiers with head wounds, gunshot injuries and neurological disorders were soon admitted to Queen Square, and on the 6th of February 1915, the War Office announced that soldiers suffering from shock were to be treated at the hospital in wards specially set apart for this purpose. So I looked at those case records. So the case records are complete from that time. There's not a single record missing. And I identified 462 cases of soldiers treated for shell shock. And as you can see, most soldiers suffered from motor disturbances. So they had paralysis of arms or legs, and this was commonly associated with a somatosensory loss, so they didn't have any feeling in the paralyzed limb. And other common symptoms were involuntary movements. Mainly, I mean, you might have come across those depictions of shell shock in films of the time. So movements in form of shaking or tremor or tics as well. This was a very, very common presentation. But it was also a very common presentation in civilian patients without any somatic disorder. And as you can see, there's also other symptoms. You see some soldiers were suffering from pseudo-seizures, so they looked like epileptic seizures, but they were post-traumatic reactions of soldiers. And what I just found, I looked at some case records in Berlin as well from the same time, was that those seizures seem to have been more common in German soldiers as compared to British soldiers. So there were some cultural differences in those presentations. So those soldiers, most soldiers who had gone through the horrors of frontline fighting, could not let go of their terrifying experiences. And if they managed to suppress some of their memories, the gruesome pictures haunted them in their dreams. And yet, as this is Frederick Walker Mott said, even in bright daylight, some soldiers drifted into dreamlike states in which they relived and often reenacted combat scenes. About 5% of soldiers treated at the National Hospital slipped in and out of these peculiar states. And you might think as well that some of those descriptions are quite similar to what we nowadays know as post-traumatic stress disorder. So those soldiers as well had flashbacks, they had nightmares. This reenactment is not so well known, is actually as well quite prevalent in soldiers nowadays, traumatized soldiers. And so one of those soldiers was 20-year-old Thomas G. So I did find one case from Belfast. I thought you might be interested in that. So 20-year-old man, as you can see, this is his diagnosis. This means epilepsy, but of course he isn't suffering from epilepsy. So he was treated at Queen Square for about 6 weeks from the end of 1915 to the end of January 1916. So he had been sent to France with the Royal Irish Rifles and had been in France for a year. And the case record reads, and this is just a picture from the Royal Irish Rifles. So one night he was out with a patrol which came into contact with a stronger patrol of Germans. The officer was shot and Thomas was hit on the head by a bomb which did not explode. He felt stunned for a time and expected the bomb to go off, but he could not move for fear of exposing himself. Later he managed to crawl back with the rest of the party and went out to get the officer back. This was found to be impossible owing to the enemy's fire. The next night he went out to look for the officer but could not find him. A day later, his regiment was leaving the trenches, and on the road he felt dizzy and then became unconscious. Since then, he has had several fits. He feels dizzy and begins to imagine all sorts of things connected with the fighting and finally loses consciousness. He is stupid when he wakes up. His sleep is rather troubled but dreams of the front. So this is quite a typical case I found in the case records. And so those soldiers, they went in and out of those dissociative states. So they had episodes when they were completely detached from their surroundings, and they usually went through some of their combat experiences. So after an initial phase of puzzlement, army doctors started an intense scientific debate on the causes of these new and perplexing symptoms. The Great War, as it was mentioned many times, turned into a huge psychological experiment through which the effects of extreme psychological and physical stress on human behavior could be studied. A central question of the wartime medical debates was whether the symptoms found in soldiers without visible wounds were the result of organic brain damage or psychological effects of the traumatic experience. And I don't know, is this working? Pointer? No, it doesn't matter. So here you can see on the right, you can see Hermann Oppenheim. He was a neurologist. How is it working? This one. Wonderful. So yeah, so Hermann Oppen here on the right side. So he introduced the concept of traumatic neurosis in 1889 to indicate the organic origin of neurological and psychological consequences of catastrophes such as railway accidents. And most German doctors, for example Max Nonne, who was based in Hamburg, stepped away from this concept very early in the war. So Oppenheim basically believed that shell shock symptoms could be based on some organic damage, some organic lesions in the brain. Max Nonne, he was a physician who actually treated, I won't say thousands, but several thousand soldiers in his Hamburg clinic with suggestion under hypnosis. And quite similar discussions took place in Britain. I don't know if you recognize anybody here on this picture. This photograph was taken in front of the Maudsley Hospital in South London. The Maudsley Hospital was opened as a specialist treatment and research center for shell shock in January 1916. And here on the right you can see Frederick Walker Mott. He was the most eminent neuropathologist of his age, and he believed that shell shock could be based on microlesions in the brain. And on the other side you can see W.H.R. Rivers. W.H.R. Rivers, who might be, you might know W.H.R. Rivers. He believed that we should take Freud's idea into account in order to treat war neurosis, and he treated the war poet Siegfried Sassoon at the Craig Lockett Hospital. So, although there was striking parallels in the discussions in Britain and Germany, British medicine remained ambivalent about the etiology, and organic interpretations prevailed long into the war, epitomized by the label shell shock. However, the organic disease model had fallen from favor by 1916. Even Oppenheim and Mott modified their views and recognized an illness model that allowed for mutual influences of psychological and somatic factors. The mystery of shell shock had been resolved, and psychological theories had won the day. There were several arguments that clearly pointed towards a psychological origin of shell shock. The first argument was that prisoners of war and severely injured soldiers didn't develop shell shock. There are some reports about that, but not so many cases. So these soldiers, obviously, because they were severely injured and imprisoned, they weren't in danger of being sent back into battle. So there wasn't any reason for them to develop shell shock symptoms. Then a second argument was that psychological therapies worked very well, and suggestive methods, including suggestion under hypnosis and in combination with electrotherapy, were popular and widely practiced in many treatment centers in Britain and Germany. So the most simple and effective way to facilitate recovery was to tell the patient either when awake or when under hypnosis that his symptoms would disappear or had already been cured. And many prominent physicians emphasized the importance of creating an atmosphere of unfeigned optimism where the patient was made to believe strongly in his own recovery. So the main therapeutic innovator at Queen Square was recruited from Canada, a young doctor in his early 30s, Louis Ralph Yealand, who had previously worked in an asylum in Canada. So he came to London in 1915 to personally treat more than 200 shell-shocked soldiers. And he documented all those cases, and he partly described those cases in his wartime publication. So one of the soldiers treated by him was Lance Corporal Patrick from the Leinster Regiment. Patrick had joined the army at the age of 15 and was in the Special Reserve. He enlisted in August 1914 and was sent to France in March 1915. So this is his case record. Some of the case records are typewritten, which is quite handy. So it says in a case record that on the 20th of April 1917 he was at Vimy Ridge with the Canadians. When they had reached the third line of German trenches, he was hit in the back by a piece of shrapnel and immediately lost power in the right arm. His Lewis gun fell out of his hand, but he had a revolver attached to a cord which was suspended from his neck. He got up quickly, was on his way back when he got lost. He saw two unarmed Germans coming out of the sub. He thought they were making for the rifles and he shot them. He was taken to the casualty clearance station and a piece of shrapnel was removed from above his right clavicle, then taken to the Canadian casualty clearance station and finally to the 3rd General Hospital in Boulogne and sent to England on the 25th of April 1917. He has been in Knapsbury Military Hospital ever since, it says, and before he was actually transferred to the National Hospital, and this is a specialist hospital as well for mental or psychological casualties. So on the 10th of September 1917 he was admitted to the National Hospital and his right arm was completely paralyzed. And this as well, I mean, he had been hit by shrapnel, but this was actually the arm with which he had shot those two Germans. So, you know, sometimes those disorders have some kind of symbolic meaning as well. You know, you can see that in quite many presentations. He also had, his head was also tilted to one side and he wasn't able to move it voluntarily. And his body was as well, you know, just turned to one side. So what happened to Patrick at the National Hospital? So his treatment is actually documented very well because we have the original case record, and this is just apart from the case record. The case records are quite detailed, but his case is also described in this 1918 publication of Louis Ralph Yealand, and it's very interesting to have that comparison, the original case record and this book, which is actually quite hard to read because some of the treatments are just really changed in a very dramatic way. So instead of quite weak electric currents, very strong electric currents are applied to the soldiers and so on. So this publication as well was harshly criticized by contemporaries and also today. So what did Yealand actually do with his electric current? So, you know, this soldier, Patrick, he had, you know, his right arm was paralyzed. So Yealand applied an electric stimulus to the arm with the effect that This produced feeling in the arm, and it also a movement in the arm. And other soldiers with paralyzed legs and paralyzed arms, they claimed that they had forgotten how to move their limbs. They didn't have this concept, this concept was missing in their brain, this concept how to use this limb. And through this demonstration of movement, they were reminded of it, and as well it was demonstrated to them that there was nothing wrong with their nerves, there was nothing wrong with their muscles. So, this treatment actually worked very well. At least, the success rate, the immediate success rate was very high. What happened to the soldiers later on when they were discharged from hospital is hardly ever documented. It is sometimes documented, and Nonne from Germany, he did some long-term follow-ups, but it was, compared to therapies we have today for those kind of disorders, quite a successful treatment. So, and Patrick was cured after a single treatment session. So it is documented in the case record and also in the book. So, as you can imagine, many soldiers were quite terrified about being treated by Yealand, and indeed, as well documented in the case records, quite many of them recovered before treatment could be initiated because they were so scared. And that's and others as well. Others decided to discharge themselves from hospital. So it was a feared treatment, but there's many soldiers. They were actually allowed to leave the hospital. Allowed to leave. They had to sign a form like today, and this form is actually handwritten by Yealand, and the soldier has just signed the form. It says this is to certify that this soldier has decided to discharge himself from the National Hospital because I am afraid to undergo treatment and so on. So they had to sign that form, and I'm not quite sure. I'd say 98% of soldiers treated at the National Hospital were actually discharged with a pension. They were granted a pension even if they had been cured. Even if they had been cured of their symptoms. So this is quite surprising. So I'm not really sure if this would have had any, I might be able to look it up, might have had some negative consequences for this soldier. This was a 19-year-old soldier who was actually gassed and severely wounded in France. So, So another argument against an organic causation of symptoms was the observation that many soldiers developed shell shock before they were sent to the front line for the first time or when they were on home leave. This is quite a common occurrence, and there are reports as well in the case records of soldiers, just breaking down before they entered the train, the dispatch train, or soldiers as well being on home leave, walking through the streets of London and developing functional seizures and other disorders. So this was quite common. So they didn't have to be exposed to combat. This is the story of David, a 27-year-old, who in June 1916 was flying over Armentières in the Lafayette Squadron. He was piloting, scouting at the time, and encountered a German who turned his machine gun on him. He was met by a second German, and then 4 more came along. His machine stopped as his petrol was exhausted and he crashed into his own lines. So he was unconscious for 4 days. He does not remember crashing, but recollects looking at the voltage. The altitude was 2,000 feet. He came to at the 9th General Hospital in Rouen, where he had a terrible headache and found himself in a plaster cast. He had fractured his spine, and he was unable to move his legs, and he was incontinent. So David was confined to bed for nearly a year in this full-body plaster cast. When he was eventually taken out of the cast, he was able to move his legs, and he was completely cured. So he had been extremely lucky. It was like a miracle. And in February 1918, he started flying again. So ironically, it was not the horrors that finally broke down his mental resistance, and not a fall from 2,000 feet, but a minor slip on the transport to England on the 12th of October 1918. It started with pain in the back and a headache, then his legs got weaker and started shaking, so that he was unable to walk. The doctors had no doubt that these symptoms were unrelated to the injuries he had obtained during his plane crash. The symptoms recurred because he had developed shell shock. So, and there's a very detailed examination, and so it's very clear that he doesn't suffer from any organic illness. And this is a typical case as well. You know, those really minor incidents lead to a complete mental breakdown. And before that, I mean, those soldiers, some of them had been, going through frontline service for years without any problems, and then they come home and they have those really minor injuries. So the cases demonstrate the far-reaching consequences of war trauma, and even hundreds of miles away from the front line, even years after the war, relatively minor tribulations could trigger major mental breakdown. And there's two more examples. This was a major explosion in London. You've probably heard of the Silvertown explosion. It happened in January 1917, and I think around 100 people died as well. And this explosion was heard, very far away. And indeed, quite a few soldiers as well, the soldiers admitted to the National Hospital, and civilians, they developed shell shock symptoms after hearing this explosion. I mean, they weren't involved in the they weren't there, but they heard the explosion and they developed symptoms. The same happened with the air raids in London, obviously the Zeppelin raids, and also the air raids later on. And this caused shell shock-like symptoms in many soldiers and also civilians. So people were really terrified about those air raids. So I'm nearly coming to the end. On 11th of November 1918, the war was over. And the war was over, but many obviously had to live with its brutal consequences. Just to give you a few examples, this was 11-year-old Louisa B., a bright and intelligent girl from Hoxton in London. Her father was discharged from the army blind. So when he arrived home, this condition was a shock to his little girl. When she saw him, she threw up her arms and screamed and kept on screaming. She fought and struggled for 3 hours. Then she developed hysterical fits in which she was violent and bit people who wanted to hold her. We don't know if she ever recovered, and this went on and on. So I found that quite moving. Obviously, this is a different, this is a postcard, not with a little girl, but a little boy and probably blind father from the First World War. I found that quite moving because I saw your, the picture you used for the conference, which also depicts a blind soldier, I believe, with a child, doesn't it? Yeah. So yeah, the war was over, but certainly not for the many children who had been exposed to air raids in their homes, like 8-year-old May, who developed a chronic condition with violent twitching and just half-sided weakness after a Zeppelin raid in London. This is her referral letter. And this is quite a common presentation in kids, actually. So they don't have to be injured. They don't even have to see the air raid. Just this fear that something might be happening, something nobody has ever experienced before. This caused those serious symptoms, and those kids are all obviously examined, and there's no evidence for any organic problem. They don't suffer from an infection. They don't suffer from a stroke, because those symptoms resemble a stroke. And those kids come back, years after the war. They never recover from that. So as well, the war was over, but not for the families who had to come to terms with the loss of their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. There's various cases of that. This is a 35-year-old music teacher, Elizabeth. She actually moved to Canada before the war to teach music. And then she was admitted in 1917, was admitted to the National Hospital with very severe depression. So her only brother was killed in action in September 1916. Her father committed suicide the following December. As I said, it's a very common narrative that fathers committed suicide after losing their sons at the front. And immediately following the death of her father, her mother went insane and had to be sent to an asylum. So, you know, those are the narratives you get after the war. And last but not least, you know, the war was not over for the tens of thousands of shell-shocked soldiers. Here, just one case I just randomly picked. This is Lionel, who I cite from his case record, went through the Battle of Jutland, in which his boat lost heavily. Before the battle, he thought he would not come through and was excited. During action itself, in spite of many explosions and concussions, he felt quite all right. When he arrived at home 5 days after action, he felt faint and giddy and could not sleep because he was worried about air raids. When he was demobilized in 1920, he became frightened about traveling in trains and crossing the road. He dreamt a lot, always blood in his dreams and someone committing suicide and him fighting without the strength to defend himself. This continued for years, probably until the end of his life. So it is estimated that more than 80,000 British servicemen suffered from shell shock. Many of them never recovered, and some of them could not live with what they had seen on the battlefield. And there is evidence in the case records as well that some of them committed suicide. Some of them even committed suicide while treated in the hospital. So, just to finish, I mean, the case records, they are invaluable because they allow us to enter a world which is now obviously inaccessible through living memory, and they provide us harrowing accounts of soldiers' experience of trench warfare, their physical and mental breakdown, and also the long-term consequences for their mental health. So in my journeys through the patient records of shell-shock hospitals in London and Berlin, I often encountered soldiers who were traumatized in the same battle, just on different sides of the front line. They had all witnessed immeasurable suffering and had been psychologically scarred. They were victims of the epidemic of trauma that at some point threatened to overshadow all other medical problems of the war. These individual histories reveal the human condition, the basic human reactions to fear and loss that transcend all political and ideological differences. So I hope that this history of shell shock will help us to remember the soldiers and those who cared for them, even beyond the years of the centenary of the Great War. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie. And finally, we have Patricia Marsh, who did her MA at Queen's, I think, in Irish Studies in 2006, and went on to do a PhD on the effects of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic in the province of Ulster. And she's going to talk to us about the Spanish flu as it's known now.
The last 6 months of the First World War coincided with one of the most virulent pandemics of the 20th century. Dubbed the Spanish flu, it struck in 3 concurrent waves throughout the world. A Ministry of Health report on the pandemic in the United Kingdom, published in 1920, stated that, quote, "It will be seen that the Irish influenza did not present either in respect of prevalence or severity any uniform variation from the type dominant in England and Wales." Now, the author expressed surprise from an epidemiological stance as, quote, "From the point of view of material well-being, the reaction of the war upon the Irish population was less prejudicial than in other divisions of the United Kingdom, and both the age and sex constitution and housing aggregation were not forced so far apart from the normal equilibrium." Evidently, it was the author's belief that Ireland's relative isolation from the war should have sheltered the country not only from the effects of the conflict, but also from the flu pandemic itself. This paper will discuss the origin of Spanish flu and its spread in Ireland, as well as the mortality and morbidity figures in Ireland and Ulster. It will examine the official response to the disease and demonstrate that the First World War impacted on both the medical and welfare response to the pandemic in Ulster. So I'm going to start with some basic facts about the flu. It was a global pandemic and there were 3 waves. The first in the spring and summer of 1918, the second wave in the autumn and winter of 1918, and the third wave in the spring of 1919. Now, almost every type of influenza pandemic is caused by the influenza A virus, which was not isolated until 1933. So, at the time, most of the world was convinced that this was a bacterial disease and that Viper's bacillus was thought to be responsible for the pandemic. The World Health Organization says that 50 million people died in this pandemic, but this could have been as many as 100 million deaths, and the true figure may never be known, as many deaths were not registered or they were registered incorrectly, and in countries such as India and Africa the registration of flu deaths was very poor indeed, so we'll really never know how many people died. So why was it called Spanish flu? Well, influenza was thought to have originated in Spain, and Spain's neutrality during the First World War meant that there were no newspaper censorship in that country, and consequently reports about influenza were published in Spanish newspapers and also in the worldwide press. Articles such as this that appeared in the Times, which reported that there was 100,000 victims in Madrid of an unknown disease that was responsible for 700 deaths within 10 days. It had caused disruption to public services, offices, factories, and that King Alfonso XIII of Spain and other leading politicians were among those afflicted. Now, these reports gave the erroneous impression that influenza had originated in Spain, leading to the pandemic being dubbed Spanish influenza. The disease, however, did not originate in Spain, and the Spanish themselves called it the soldier of Naples. So where did it come from? Well, there's a few theories, and one theory is that it originated as early as the winter of 1916 on the Western Front at the British Army camp at Ypres. Now, the outbreaks at Ypres were diagnosed at the time as a disease called purulent bronchitis, but they showed the same symptoms as Spanish flu in hindsight, and Dr. Herbert French, author of the aforementioned Ministry of Health report, was strongly of the opinion that the fatal cases from purulent bronchitis were likely to be the same as those from the pandemic. There were also theories that it developed in China and made its way with Chinese workers to the Western Front, or indeed to America, where we have the most popular theory, and that is that it started in the United States. The earliest recorded outbreak of the disease was on the 5th of March 1918 among Army recruits at Camp Funston, Fort Riley in Kansas. And by the end of March it had spread to military training installations in several US, Midwestern and Southeastern states. And from here it travelled with troops to the Western Front on troop ships that were breeding grounds for infection. So what were the symptoms? Well, there were 2 sharply distinguished parts to this pandemic. During the first wave in June 1918, there were very many cases, but the mortality was relatively low. Patients recovered quickly after a short severe attack, and it was widely described as influenza of the 3-day fever type. However, during the second and third waves in October 1918 and February 1919, there was a high mortality from pulmonary and general septicemic complications. Patients complained initially about chest pains, had a short, dry, hacking cough, their skin became hot, dry and pungent, and occasionally a temperature rash like scarlet fever was noted. Breathing became rapid and the pulse rate rose. The face was at first flushed and red, but then in severe cases it became more and more lavender, heliotrope or violet in colour. And this was a symptom known as Heliotrope Cyanosis. And during the second wave, Heliotrope Cyanosis was a prominent feature of fatal cases. This was where the sufferer's lips and ears would turn purple or blue, while the rest of their skin first flushed, then turned pale white or grey, the colour of wet ashes, the outcome of which would inevitably be death. Now, army doctors were content while the patient's face remained red, regardless of lung signs, temperature, pulse rate or respiration rate. However, when heliotrope cyanosis set in, then, quote, the prospect was very grave indeed. This symptom developed in less than half of the pulmonary cases. But once it became definite, the prognosis was so bad that around 95% of the so-called blue cases died. Now, although this symptom was a very serious and noticeable symptom, it did not appear in all cases. And in Ireland, the Assistant Director of Medical Services at the Curragh military camp reported that there were very few cases of Heliotrope Cyanosis among their military influenza patients during the pandemic. Other symptoms experienced during this wave were severe headaches, body pain and fever. Patients also coughed blood and bled from the nose. Bacteria invaded the lungs and turned these vital organs into sacs of fluid, which caused death by effectively drowning the sufferer in their own body fluids. And post-mortems of victims showed that their lungs, as well as other major organs, were often filled with the solid red jelly. So it wasn't a very pleasant disease to get, I wouldn't think. So how did it spread or get to Ireland? Well, there were 3 distinct waves of influenza in Ireland, as elsewhere, and they occurred in June 1918, the autumn of 1918, and February of 1919. The earliest verifiable record of flu in the country was an outbreak on the USS Dixie, which was docked outside Queenstown, now Cove, in May of 1918. However, this outbreak appeared to be confined to the ship, as there's no evidence that it reached the town itself. The first wave proper was principally in Belfast and other districts of the north of Ireland. Flu was first reported on the 12th of June in Belfast when a notice appeared in the Belfast newspapers regarding the reopening after influenza of a department in James Mackey and Sons munition factory. From Belfast it spread east to Holywood and Bangor by the end of June, and southwest to Lisburn, Lurgan and Portadown by mid-June, probably via the rail network. There were sporadic outbreaks of Ballinasloe, Dublin, Tipperary and Athlone during June and early July of 1918. And significantly, most of these outbreaks were located in close proximity to an army or naval base. Influenza within the military camps was rife. The reports of the medical and sanitary work of the Ulster Brigade confirms that during June and July of 1918, there were approximately 5,000 influenza cases in military hospitals throughout Ulster. And the general consensus was that influenza was spread by returning troops who were home on leave or to convalesce from wounds in the hospitals, and then it was spread via the rail network throughout the north of Ireland. The second wave originated in Leinster and Howth on the east coast, and it was first reported on the 1st of October. It spread throughout Leinster to Dundalk, Drogheda, Wexford and Kilkenny by the end of that month. And first reports of the flu in Ulster itself were in Larne on the 9th of October, and that probably entered through the Royal Naval bases situated there. It reached Belfast by the end of October 1918. Now, this wave spread to most towns in Ulster, and in fact most towns in Ireland, and it was, in most cases, this was the most virulent wave of the 3 waves. Donegal was badly affected during this wave, unlike Mayo and other areas in the west of Ireland. And the lack of influenza in rural parts of Connacht may have been due to the absence of an extensive rail network in that part of the country. The third wave lasted from mid-February to mid-April, and it originated in Leinster and County Kildare, and it spread to Dublin. Again, it visited most towns in Ulster, but in many, such as Belfast, Derry, Lurgan and Strabane, it was a milder wave than those of 1918. And this was thought to be because immunity had been gained from the previous waves in 1918. However, Dublin, County and Borough suffered severely during all three waves of the pandemic. And this may be because of the really bad living conditions in Dublin, the tenements and the massive population. There was recurrence of the flu in County Donegal with a severe outbreak along the northeastern seaboard of the county. And we can see from this map, there's a map of Ireland, and the shaded area of the map shows the areas in Ireland that had a higher mortality during 1919 than they had in 1918. So what you can see is the western part of Ireland suffered more during the 1919 wave, and it also shows that the flu sort of came in the east of Ireland, died out, and then it came in to the west of Ireland in 1919. So how many people died? Well, speaking in 1920, the Registrar General for Ireland, Sir William Thompson, stated, and I quote, "Since the period of the Great Famine, with its awful attendant horrors of fever and cholera, No disease of any epidemic nature created so much havoc in any one year in Ireland as influenza. The official influenza death toll recorded for Spanish flu in the country was 20,057 people. And as this table shows here, Leinster and Ulster had the highest death tolls. There were 7,582 people who died in Ulster from the flu and 6,123 in Leinster. And Leinster had the highest death rate per population. Pneumonia was a common complication in influenza cases, and if the excess pneumonia figures, mortality figures for 1918 and 1919 are added to the influenza death toll, a more accurate mortality for the duration of the pandemic would be 23,000 people. However, the death toll could have been much higher, as not all influenza deaths in Ireland were registered, and also some were registered incorrectly. So though we've added in respiratory diseases such as pneumonia, diseases such as deaths from complication of TB or bronchitis aren't added into those figures. Now this table shows the death rates per thousand of population in the Ulster Poor Law Union districts. During 1918, the Inishowen Poor Law Union district had the highest influenza death rate per thousand of population in Ulster. Now, this high death rate in this rural area may be due to the presence of the military. The Lough Swilly defences were situated on the Inishowen Peninsula, and during the war, the strength of the troops in this area varied between 4,000 and 6,000 people, or men, at Lennon Fort, Dunree Fort and Malin Head barracks, and they were situated in this area. Although Belfast district had the highest population and indeed the highest amount of people who died, it had the fourth highest death rate in Ulster per thousand of population. And this is surprising, as both the first and second waves of the disease were reported in the city and district. Both waves were also reported in the industrial area of Lurgan, which had the third highest rate, but it was Newry that had the second highest rate. And this is noteworthy, as this district appeared to have avoided the first wave and only had the second wave, so all of these deaths occurred in the autumn wave in 1918. In 1919, County Donegal was badly affected again, suffering higher mortality during the third wave than the combined mortality of the first two waves in 1918. Now, Donegal Poor Law Union had the highest influenza death rate per thousand of population, followed by Dunfanaghy, Stranraer, Ballintees, Ballyshannon and Letterkenny. At the time, this was blamed on the military presence and the demobilisation of soldiers in the county. Belfast had the lowest death rate, you can't really see there, but it is the lowest one there, during this wave, along with Newry, Lurgan and Inishowen, which were the top four in 1918. They all had a much lower death rate in 1919. And again, this was thought to be because they gained immunity from the previous two waves. So how many people contracted the flu? Well, we'll never know really. The exact influenza morbidity is unknown, as no accurate records were kept of incidents of influenza during this period. However, it has been estimated that the mortality rate of this virus was 2.5% of those infected. Therefore, as many as 802,000 or up to 929,000 Irish people may have been infected by influenza during the pandemic. And as you can see from that table, as many as 303,000 people could have contracted disease in the province of Ulster. So who was most vulnerable and died from influenza? Well, certain professions such as nurses, doctors, policemen and members of the clergy were vulnerable to the flu, as were pregnant women. In industrial areas such as Belfast, Lurgan and Lisburn, there were many deaths among factory workers and their family members. In Donegal, many of the people who died from the flu were from the farming community. Tragically, many servicemen returned home safely from the war, only to contract influenza and subsequently die. And during November 1918, in Derry in 1 week, 12 deaths were reported at the military barracks where influenza was said to be rampant. There was another global peculiarity of this pandemic, and that was how it targeted young adults in particular. Normally, influenza kills the very young or the very old. But the Spanish flu showed an unusual age distribution of deaths. There was still very high mortality among the very young and the very old, but there was an unusually high death rate among the age group between 15 and 44. In England and Wales, mortality seemed to be concentrated among those aged 20 to 40, and especially those 25 to 35. And it has been suggested that this peculiarity helped to produce Britain's lost generation, caused by both the mortality of soldiers due to war, as well as that from influenza on the home front. The Registrar General noted in 1918 that 55.5% of all the deaths from influenza in Ireland were of people aged between 15 and 45, and that more than 58% of the total influenza mortality in 1919 was between the ages of 20 and 65. This slide is one of my own, and it's a graphical representation of the age-specific influenza death rates for Ireland, and it compares 1918 and 1919. And as you can see, there are still very high mortality from the very young and the very old, but it's this age group here, certainly in 1918, that there was had the highest death toll, the highest death rate. But 1919, it also had quite a high death rate, and that's the 20 to 35-year-old age group. So why was the pandemic so detrimental to this particular age group? Well, there's a few theories. One is that elderly people gained immunity to the 1918 pandemic from previous exposure to an influenza epidemic in 1847, and that may have been caused by a similar H1 virus. However, it doesn't explain why there was still such a high death rate in old people in 1918. Another is that young adults are more likely to attempt work through illness, thus maximising their risk of succumbing to the flu. So if you didn't work, you didn't get paid, no sick pay, you couldn't feed yourself or your family. So people got up and they worked even though they were ill. And there's many examples right throughout the United Kingdom of people dying on trams or collapsing on trams or trains on their way to work and subsequently dying of the disease. There's also the theory that many of the age group 20 to 45 have been soldiers living in miserable conditions on the Western Front, but that doesn't explain the same death rates being seen in countries where it was unaffected by war and young people who hadn't been to war. However, a scientific study that took place in 2007 on the cat monkeys showed that those infected with the isolated 1918 virus experienced a rapid spread of flu throughout the respiratory system, causing them to die within days, damage that mirrored reports of human patients in 1918. The results showed that the 1918 virus caused the monkey's immune system to go into overdrive. Therefore, it could be that the strong immune system of young adults overreacted to the virus, causing this particular age group to be most at risk during the pandemic. So, what were the cures and treatments? Well, unsurprisingly, as the real cause of influenza was unknown at the time, and there still isn't a known cure for the disease, there was little consensus among the Irish medical profession on the best treatment for or prevention against the disease, which resulted in many cures and treatments being suggested. Some Irish doctors recommended gargling with a tincture of creosote or a solution of permanganate of potash, chamomile as a purgative, oxygen, stimulants such as strychnine, and some preparation of opium for sleepiness, and quinine. Quinine, in fact, was a popular treatment choice, and Dr. Daley, the medical officer of health for Belfast, recommended taking quinine tablets of between 2 and 5 grains twice a day as a tonic and a preventative. Irish Sinn Féin leader Arthur Griffith, who had contracted influenza at Gloucester Jail in 1919, consumed a full bottle of quinine and advocated that it successfully cured his influenza attack. Now, whether it did or not is open to debate. The following article, which listed recommendations for prevention of influenza, appeared in many newspapers. And the recommendations included: breathe through your nose and not your mouth, make yourself sneeze night and morning, walk home from work, sleep with your windows open and your bed warm, and do not dope. Some doctors widely endorsed the use of alcohol in influenza cases to relieve pain and bolster strength. And the Ministry of Food regarded the shortage of spirits in some districts as a health problem. And during December 1918, they arranged for special supplies of spirits to be sent to influenza patients in districts where there was a shortage and where medical opinion showed the need existed. In February 1919, the Dublin Public Health Committee requested the War Cabinet to call for the immediate release of supplies of whisky in the interests of public health. Now, as alcohol continued to be recommended by Irish doctors, unsurprisingly, medicated wines and tonics were not only advertised as influenza remedies, but also as post-influenza pick-me-ups. Lauren wine merchant John Crawford recommended port wine for fighting the flu. Tonic wine Antilaria was advertised as an influenza antidote, and medicated wine Hall's wine claimed to act as restorative after influenza. Advertisements for many products claiming to have curative or preventative powers against the flu appeared in newspapers throughout Ireland. And as influenza was believed to be a bacterial infection, disinfection was considered to be a good preventative. Lifebuoy soap claimed to be a reputable germicide and sure disinfectant, and a nationally established disinfectant proclaimed guard against influenza by the daily use of Jez fluid. And disinfectant with Jez fluid was one of the recommendations of the Dublin Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Charles Cameron, in dealing with the flu. Oxo and Bovril were popular beef teas of the day, and that were thought to strengthen the body against the onslaught of disease. And there was an assortment of advertisements for Oxo during the second and third waves, which declared that it fortifies the system against influenza infection. So popular are these products that during December 1918, a series of advertisements apologised for the shortage of Bovril due to the influenza outbreak. Now, Bovril was considered a very important form of nourishment, so much so that during November 1918, the Belfast Guardian increased the Bovril rations of the nurses by 1/4 of an ounce per day to boost their diet to help them cope with their increased workload. Snuff was advertised as preventative, and Belfast tobacco firm Gallagher's recommended their high-toast snuff to prevent influenza or colds in the head. And this claim may not be as implausible as it seems, as one of the popular recommendations to avoid the flu was make yourself sneeze night and morning. But maybe one of the most extraordinary claims was by the Dunlop Rubber Company, who extolled the virtues of cycling with very few of the people who have had influenza are regular cyclists. Those who bicycle regularly have been less liable to attack. Now, ironically, in County Louth, the champion cyclist and County GAA footballer Joe Ross died from influenza during the second wave, so it doesn't seem that cycling did him much good during this epidemic. In reality, there was no cure for influenza. The official response to the flu in Ireland was lacklustre, which was hardly surprising as throughout the United Kingdom, central government gave little support or advice to local authorities on how to combat the disease. Sir Arthur Newsom was the Chief Medical Officer for the local government board based in London during the pandemic, and he came under criticism for his lack of action, especially during the first wave. Newsom acknowledged that more could have been done, especially during the first wave. Measures such as isolating the sick from the healthy, prevention of mass migrations and overcrowding should have been implemented, but he believed that this had not been possible due to the demands of war. And quote, "It was necessary to carry on, and the relentless needs of warfare justified incurring the risk of spreading infections." In fact, it wasn't until the 15th of November, after the armistice, that the local government board in Britain issued any recommendations on dealing with influenza in the form of a memorandum. And that's the front page of it there. This memorandum was circulated to all medical officers of health in England, Scotland, Wales, and to the local government board in Ireland. And in Ulster, the local authorities looked towards the local government board in Ireland for guidance on dealing with public health matters. The local government board in Ireland in turn acted on instruction from the local government board in London, and as we've already mentioned, they didn't provide much help to anybody, so this meant that little advice or support was given to Irish local authorities. But some of the measures taken by the local government board for Ireland were as follows. They were quite limited. They allowed local authorities to employ additional medical and nursing assistants if the need arose. They recommended that county councils allow their tuberculosis officers to undertake the duties of district medical officers if it was needed. They didn't add the influenza to the list of notifiable diseases, and as it was decided, for various probably legitimate reasons, that this measure would not stop the spread of the disease. Nor did they advocate the use of vaccination or indeed supply vaccines to Board of Guardians for the use and treatment of the disease, as they were not confident that vaccines would confer immunity from influenza attack. Now, they're probably quite correct in that, but probably their lack of enthusiasm for vaccines may have been as much to do with the expense of vaccines rather than their effectiveness. In March 1919, they recommended notification of acute primary pneumonia and acute influenza pneumonia, as well as more exotic diseases such as malaria and trench fever, and this was due to the demobilisation and the return of troops serving abroad. So although most local authorities recommended the closure of day, Sunday and technical schools, they lacked the authority to make it compulsory. The Local Government Board for Ireland wouldn't give them any authority to do that. And several councils wanted to close cinemas to the public, but again this action was not sanctioned by the Local Government Board, or in fact anywhere in the UK. In reality, official bodies provided little support to Irish local authorities on how to combat influenza. Most local authorities left the decisions of coping with the disease to their individual medical officers of health, with varying results. Another problem faced locally was the lack of both hospital accommodation and medical personnel to treat those suffering from the flu. During this period, many civil medical institutions in Ireland acted as auxiliary military hospitals, and it was common for the military to requisition workhouses or wards within them for the treatment of soldiers. Now, this caused difficulties when it came to treating the local poor. And it has been argued that in mainland Britain, the War Office was widely criticised with respect to hospital accommodation, as there was dissatisfaction about the lack of adequate provision for civilians. In Ulster, the Strabane workhouse, and that's a picture of it more recently I suppose, was requisitioned by the military prior to the influenza outbreak in the town in October 1918. This meant that there was no hospital for the sick poor in that Union district. There were 3 deaths from unspecified causes in Strabane during October 1918, and these were blamed on the lack of a properly staffed hospital. One boy who had died from influenza had lain on a bed of straw and bags due to the lack of beds. Now, Strabane Fever Hospital was eventually reopened to the public, but that was on the 12th of November 1918. So in the intervening time, sick cases and influenza cases from that dispensary district were sent to Castledurn, Stranraer and Londonderry workhouses. And the problem with that is that these institutions became overcrowded and they weren't able to adequately treat their local poor. So it was overcrowding in workhouses, infirmaries was a problem, especially in Londonderry during the 2nd and 3rd influenza outbreaks, and in other ones because those patients from Strabane were coming to Derry to be treated. There was also a shortage of suitable medical personnel, and that impacted detrimentally on influenza patients. Irish dispensary doctors made over 100,000 more home visits to patients during 1918 compared to the previous 12 months, indicating that doctors were under severe work pressure during this pandemic. A scarcity of temporary doctors throughout Ireland added to the problem, as large numbers of medical practitioners were serving with His Majesty's forces on the Western Front. Not only doctors were in short supply, so too were nurses. Professional nurses like doctors have volunteered for both the Army and Naval Medical Corps. And the Local Government Board for Ireland noted that the nursing staff in Irish medical institutions was considerably depleted because of the high wartime demand for their professional services. Now, the importance of qualified and competent nurses both at home and on the Western Front shouldn't be underestimated. There was no cure for the flu, so realistically the only practical aid that could be given to a patient was to nurse them while they were ill. Poor law infirmaries struggled to ensure that they were adequately staffed, especially if medical personnel, particularly nurses, contracted the flu themselves. In Ulster, there were numerous reports of professional nurses who contracted the flu during the course of their duties. At least 6 nurses in the Belfast infirmary died, 2 in Derry and 2 in Lurgan from the flu during the pandemic. So, in conclusion, there's no doubt that soldiers returning to various Irish hospitals and barracks were instrumental in introducing influenza to Ireland and its subsequent spread throughout the country. The need to help the war effort in Britain and Ireland also influenced how the central government responded to the disease. Little advice or support was forthcoming for local authorities from the Local Government Board of Ireland, and civil institutions and hospitals and union infirmaries with wards therein were requisitioned by military, sometimes to the detriment of the local poor, revealing one of the ways in which the war disrupted health provision to the Irish on the Irish domestic home front. Added to this was the shortage of medical personnel, many of whom were serving on the Western Front. So though the 1920 Ministry of Health report suggested that the impact of the war was less prejudicial to the Irish population than the rest of the United Kingdom, the evidence shows that the war also had a profound detrimental effect on Ulster during this pandemic. Thank you very much.